All right, guys. So we're gonna do here is pick up talking about bone homeostasis. So we know that bones are highly dynamic, right? Because we talked about how you get new compact bone every 14 years or so, and new spongy bone every several years. So it means that there are factors that must influence bone growth and degradation, and it depends on these three things, you guys. There's hormones, vitamins, and exercise can all affect the growth of bone in different ways. Okay, so we'll talk about the hormones that actually influence bone growth or bone resorption, which is breakdown. We'll talk about some of the vitamins that are associated with bone growth, as well as the role of exercise on bone growth. So for hormones, you guys, basically these are released by endocrine glands. Remember, endocrine glands are the ductless glands throughout your body. They release hormones, which are signaling molecules inside of your bloodstream, and those signaling molecules can make it to some of these bone cells like osteoblasts and osteoclasts. So you can make osteoblasts more active or osteoclasts more active. And then we talked about how you want blast and clast activity under most circumstances to be fairly stable, right? You don't want too much osteoblast activity, otherwise the bone can get too thick. And you don't want too much osteoclast activity, otherwise bones can become more brittle. So we'll talk about the hormones that influence each. So for the vitamins, there's various vitamins that also affect bone growth. You guys may be familiar with like vitamin D, right? We understand that affects bone growth. In fact, vitamin D insufficiency in childhood is called rickets. In adults, we call osteomalacia. But there's also other vitamins that play a role in bone growth. Okay, and then exercise plays a role too, you guys. So this table's from our book. What we see here are the different hormones that affect bone growth. So growth hormone. What do you guys think this does to bones? Makes it grow. Yeah, that's nice. Kind of straightforward there. Thyroid hormone also influences bone growth. So thyroid hormone is one of those really important hormones that not only regulates metabolism through your body or energy usage, but also regulates bone growth. So someone with low thyroid hormone levels may have more brittle bones, right? Calcitonin is released by your thyroid gland as well. This actually also promotes bone growth. So it helps take calcium out of your bloodstream and puts it into bone. But opposite to this, you guys, we have parathyroid hormone. PTH, or parathyroid hormone, increases blood calcium levels by encouraging the breakdown of bone or resorption of bone. So what if someone had a tumor where they secreted a lot of parathyroid hormone? What would happen to their bone then? It'd break down, yeah. You see a lot of osteoporosis from that parathyroid secreting tumor. So glucocorticoids are also stress hormones, you guys. If they're too high, if your stress hormones are too high, that also prevents bone growth. So what if someone were stressed for like years and their glucocorticoid levels were really high? What can you assume then about their bones? They may be more brittle because they haven't grown as much. Exactly. But what about sex hormones, you guys, like estrogen and testosterone? Well, these actually both promote bone growth. I know maybe you would assume potentially that testosterone promotes bone growth and estrogen doesn't, but it's not true. Like both these sex hormones, testosterone and estrogen, both promote bone growth and growth of skeletal tissues like cartilage, tendons and ligaments, that kind of stuff. So most of these hormones here, as you can see, promote bone growth. So which were the two that promote bone resorption or breakdown? Parathyroid and glucocorticoids. So parathyroid hormones released when your blood calcium levels are too low, and where you get that calcium then is by breaking down bone. That way you can get your blood calcium levels back up. Glucocorticoids are stress hormones, so during like more chronic stress responses, then someone's bones may become brittle in the long run. Otherwise, growth hormone, thyroid hormone, calcitonin, and sex hormones all stimulate bone growth or deposition. So they make bone kind of thicker and more strong. Other vitamins, you guys, like A, C, and D, these all promote bone growth in a variety of ways. Vitamin A activates osteoblasts. Vitamin C promotes collagen production. We know collagen is one of those fibers that's necessary for this particular variety of connective tissue, because you find a lot of collagen fibers in bone. And then vitamin D promotes absorption of calcium. So you guys heard of vitamin C deficiency before. That's scurvy. So if you're not getting enough vitamin C in your diet, then not only will that affect collagen in like connective tissues like skin. So scurvy, you saw like brittling of skin. Skin becomes much more weak and can easily tear. But it also makes bones weaker because now you have difficulty forming the collagen in bones. So bones will start to become brittle as well. In fact, back in the day, when people are on these ships for months at a time, they'd carry a lot of like citrus with them, which are high in vitamin C, and they'd like suck on lemons and stuff. That way they get enough vitamin C in their diet to make the journey without getting scurvy, right? Or you can get vitamin D deficiency with rickets in childhood. Where do you get vitamin D from? Yeah, sun exposure, exactly. There's other dietary sources of it too. Yeah, exactly. So it can be added to certain foods sometimes. Fish are really high in vitamin D, like sardines, if you like that kind of thing. Yeah.
So in an adult, too much like the stress hormone or something can make the bones brittle. What about like in a child because they're still growing? If they had too much stress or their hormones or whatever off, would that prevent growth as well?
It might. That sounds like a research study. That's a great question, though. So what's the effect of childhood stress on bone growth? That sounds like an excellent research study. I don't know what the consequence of that question would be, but based on this information, I would guess that it probably would. Yeah. So what about the effect of exercise, you guys? We talked about how you either use it or you lose it, right? So with exercise, what we find is that mechanical stress stimulates osteoblast activity. These osteoblasts can lay down new osteoid and help thicken bone. So what's the evidence for this? Well, in athletes that do certain sports, what you find is the bones they use for that activity become larger and thicker and more strong. So one of the more classic examples of this is like a tennis player, where like if you're playing tennis, you have a dominant hand and a non-dominant arm, right? Like a serving arm or a non-serving arm. Well, in the serving arm, then you're going to find that those bones are going to be much thicker than the non-serving arm because then you're not using the non-serving arm as strongly, right? So you can see even in one person, even one limb can have bones that are more strong than another limb, depending on how you use those bones, right? You might wonder then, well, what about someone who's a cyclist? Well, bones of maybe their hands for gripping and bones of their vertebral column or, of their legs, because they're going to get a lot more stress in that regard. But it's the mechanical stress itself that stimulates osteoblast activity. So that's the key point here, you guys, mechanical stress. So you want to have, let's think about elderly too. The elderly need to remain ambulatory. They need to be able to keep moving. Once they stop moving, they just start kind of sitting around, then their bones start to brittle due to that lack of mechanical stress, and it puts them at higher risk for fractures. So it's not true that elderly should just sit and rest. People should stay as active as they can for as long as they can. If they want to increase their longevity and quality of life. Yeah.
So when you see somebody, or say you're arm wrestling, you're stronger in one arm, you always, or I would think you assume that's muscle. Your muscle strength is stronger. But does that actually mean that your bone in that arm, because it's dominant or leg or whatever?
That's a good question. So yeah, if you're an arm wrestler, let's say if you're a professional arm wrestler, I like that one. Which that's a thing, right? Like some of the arm people who are professional arm wrestlers, right? They're probably gonna have one really strong arm, and then maybe like my arm, like a tiny little skinny arm, right? Maybe you can only work out one arm, right? Well, what's interesting then is that muscles, they put physical stress on bone too. So what happens then is that, let's say if you are an arm wrestler and you have one really strong arm, well, that means the bones in that arm wrestling arm, like your good arm, they also get larger. But here's the interesting thing, though, is that muscles can get stronger before bones get stronger. So some of the injuries you see, like with early weight training and activities, is that someone's muscles will get stronger before the bones can catch up. So they end up getting, tendon and ligament injuries because their bones haven't really strengthened well enough yet with the more rapid increases in muscle strength. So people have a tendency to overdo it, right? If they start going to the gym and start lifting weights, they might see that they can get really rapid increases in strength dramatically, but it takes longer for other skeletal tissues to catch up. Like bones will eventually get thicker based on the mechanical stress placed on it. Same with tendons and ligaments will eventually get stronger, but you'll see tears and that kind of stuff early on. Yeah.
This is sort of the opposite. Like when I got my cast off my arm, the arm I had the cast on was so much tinier, like the wrist.
Yeah.
Is that kind of the opposite because I wasn't able to use those muscles on that bone, the bone actually shrank?
You got it. In fact, we all grew up with the idea that you got to wear a cast for as long as that bone's healing. There's a new idea now out, and actually I think it makes more sense to me. As long as you can tolerate like a moderate amount of pain, it's actually better to not cast if you can. You know, like if you break a bone and a cast isn't necessarily the most important thing there, maybe just put it like in a more soft tissue kind of sling sort of thing. What you find then is that you don't see that same degree of atrophy of muscle and bone. It actually improves outcomes. If your leg's casted for 3 months or something, you're going to see a lot of atrophy or decrease in the size of both muscle and bone. And I just know this for one because my wife broke her arm some years back and they didn't put her in a cast. But she had a complete fracture through her radius. They didn't even cast her. Not one cast. It wasn't like a temporary cast for 3 days. Just, they didn't even cast her at all. And then they had her using it as much as she could. And it was unfortunate because it was really painful to use an arm that's broken, right? But you get better outcomes that way. So it's kind of interesting. You just kind of fight through the pain. Yeah, exactly. You got it. So what about fracture repair, you guys? If you do break a bone, how does that bone repair itself? Well, we know that bone is highly vascular, right? So if the bone breaks, blood vessels will break. And when blood vessels break, they leak blood out of the vessel, right? When blood leaks out of a vessel, we call it a hematoma. So one of the first phases of fracture repair is what we call a fractured hematoma, where blood leaks out of that fracture and starts to fill in that space. The second phase of fracture repair is that blood clot, or hematoma, turns into a fibrocartilaginous callus, or soft callus. So that the first type of tissue that reforms is actually not bone, it's cartilage. Kind of like going back again, right? So you're kind of going back to what it sort of started out like, although this is fibrocartilage, it's a little tougher than hyaline cartilage. And then that gets eventually ossified into a bony callus, right? This bony or hard callus is eventually remodeled, and this process of remodeling takes years or even decades. In fact, you can actually, there's evidence of previous fracture in bones that maybe were broken like 20, 30 years ago. There's still some visual evidence there because you can see it from the fact that when this bony callus comes back, it doesn't necessarily always match the surrounding bone. Often it can be a little wider, and eventually it's sort of remodeled. It looks more and more like the surrounding bone. In fact, people who study bones and maybe like forensic anthropologists, they can know how long ago a fracture occurred based on the degree of remodeling, which is pretty cool. They can guess, okay, this fracture was a year ago, or this fracture was 10 years ago. They're that good at recognizing these things. So what this slide shows you guys is the processes of fracture repair. So we get our fracture hematoma that forms first. Then we get our fibrocartilaginous callus, or soft callus, followed by a bony callus, and then remodeling, where it starts to kind of look like the surrounding bone, but it's not quite the same. This process of remodeling takes years, decades, right? And depending on how old you are, it might not ever fully remodel to look just like the surrounding bone, but it does a pretty good job, though. So it's kind of interesting. So where do you guys think the stem cells come from to make this fibrocartilage in the bone? Periosteum and endosteum. So both the periosteum and endosteum can have mesenchymal stem cells that can actually lay down new connective tissue. This is cartilage, though, right? Now, then that's eventually turned into the bony callus, where that cartilage is then ossified into bone. So, kind of cool. So, what this slide shows, then you guys, are different types of common bone fractures. So, we have things like our Cole's fracture, which just happens to have, occur here in this little area. Comminuted fractures, where lots of different fragments can break away. We have a compound fracture, or also called an open fracture, where bone can start to protrude through skin, where the skin barrier is now broken. We have green stick fracture, which is basically where the bone breaks like a green stick, right? Like, you guys ever tried to break a stick that's not fully dry yet? Muscles that are attached to your shin bone or tibia, not only can they pull away the periosteum, that can also cause little micro fractures in the bone, which would be like a stress fracture. Or some pathologies or trauma. A simple fracture is where the bone is broken all the way through, but does not penetrate the skin, okay? So these bone markings, you guys, we went over in lab. So these are the markings that we'll be talking about in lab, over the course of this next week as well. So these markings are named for what they do. So there's menopause and andropause. Everyone's heard of menopause because that's when the ovaries stop producing as many eggs or at all, and therefore you don't have a lot of vitamins, right? Maybe like a lot of processed foods like TV dinners and stuff, then that can also put you at risk for osteoporosis. So it's kind of interesting.